Yeah, welcome to another edition of the MC65 show. So, welcome everybody. Today we are talking about the future of Microsoft Mail development, requirement from Exchange Web Services, and what developers should be doing right now to prepare. Join Joining me is Microsoft MVP Glen Scales. Glen has been written about Exchange development since 2004 and has worked across every major Exchange programming model from CDO, web dev through EWS and now Microsoft Graph. His blog posts, shell libraries, Stack Overflow answers, and Substack articles have helped thousands of developers solve real-world messaging challenges. So, you've been building against Exchange over 20 years. What first got you into messaging development?
It's a bit of an interesting one. My first job was with SAP, and I used to do a user conference every year. So I was tasked with installing Exchange and building the system, and then doing provisioning for every user at that conference. And back then, having an email address for a conference was a big thing. So, so yeah, my first Exchange code was a provisioning system for that conference, and then it sort of just grew gradually from there. Just as back then, I guess, mail development was the cutting edge. It's not so much today, it's more legacy side. And things have moved on to Teams and other things, obviously AI at the moment. But yeah, that's it's sort of grown out of that.
Yeah. When you look back at the evolution from on-prem Exchange to Microsoft 365, what
Yep.
changed the most for developers?
I think it was it's probably more the shift to from EWS to Graph that you went from the SOAP protocol now to REST. There's a lot more interaction with sort of open source libraries, so it's a lot more easier to use. Um, Obviously, the shift to Microsoft 365 has been obviously greater authentication. So you've got OAuth now. The fundamentals of the mail API hasn't changed that much.
Mm, You worked through CDO, WebDev, EVS, and now Graph. What lessons has Microsoft carried forward and what got left behind?
Um, I think they've learned that they should have kept developing the graph. They sort of there was a big development effort in up to about 2018, and then they kind of stopped and they didn't hit the feature parity side of it. And then obviously when Midnight Blizzard came along, and obviously that attacked the Microsoft executives and things like that. So they said, well, security is a big issue for them now, and there's no granular security within EWS. So that's kind of why it's basically being depreciated. So I think that they learned that they should have kept on that sort of development path of Graph to get it to parity. They're sort of running a bit of catch up now. So there's some things that aren't quite there, but they're working hard to get there, I guess.
Yeah, your blog became famous because it's covered the undocumented behavior and edge cases. Why do Exchange APIs tend to have so many gray areas?
I think it probably goes back to just the legacy of MAPI. So there's MAPI as a protocol it was developed in the 80s. So the underlying data structures are a bit different. It's all a lot of there's a lot of binary stuff there. How they store information's it's a little bit different as well. But there are some there are just underlying complexities in calendaring more than email. Email is relatively simple, but if you go into things like encryption and signing, it gets a little bit more complicated. But a thing like a recurring meeting and how they store that as a data structure in Mappy is very different from how how it's stored in Mime, for instance, or the sort of open protocols that are out there. So it's very different, and it goes back to, I guess, the proprietary nature of Exchange. But I mean, Exchange and what's the Active Directory have become the sort of underlying substrate that powers Microsoft 365 now.
So Glenn, you are really long in the business. What were some of the strangest or hardest exchange development issue you have ever been matched?
I definitely, I worked for a number of years in migration. So obviously migrating when BPOS came online, obviously the precedent from my Microsoft 365. So migrating people from the on-prem to the cloud. There was, that was years of work. Public folder migration was probably, I spent a couple of years building two different types of migration apps that work, but how it gets very complicated with public folders when you're trying to when things get split across multiple stores, and how things actually get routed to the back end. The cloud is very challenging as well because you don't. It's a little bit of a black box. You sort of you're pushing data into the cloud, but you're never quite sure where it's getting routed, and mailboxes may be getting moved in the background while you're trying to push data into them, and that creates a number of different challenges. So you've got to make sure that your apps are always very resilient when you're dealing with anything sort of email related, I guess.
Yeah, let's just jump into the big news. Microsoft is retiring Exchange Web Services in October 2006, right? And what exactly is what's being described?
They're depreciating EWS itself in October, so that's in 4 months' time. So if you have an application that's using EWS at all, line of business application, contact management application, CRM integration, in October, they're going to switch something in the tenant so that EWS requests are blocked. You can switch it back on for about 6 months. So you basically get to April to sort of rectify or migrate or fix whatever you didn't sort of know was there. But after April 2027, there'll be no EWS in the cloud. It only affects the cloud. So if you have on-prem service, EWS is still the API, still the go-to API. But any applications that are using EWS to access the cloud or Microsoft 365, um, there's you in October, you're going to find that unless you've done something within your tenant to make sure that it doesn't happen, they're going to be blocked. But you then can switch it back on. But then you've got 6 months to sort of mitigate anything that you didn't mitigate at that point.
How can organizations figure out if they have applications depend on EDS?
So within the admin portal, there's a usage sort of an EWS usage report that will tell you which EWS operations are in use and which application IDs are using those operations. So there's also other scripts that you can run to work out then within that application ID, what clients are then using it, what IP addresses are then using it. But yeah, you need to look at the admin portal, look at the Exchange usage reports, and there's a separate AWS screen there will show you which application IDs, and then you need to track by the application ID, what that's doing, whether it's associated with a line of business application or an ISV's application or a Microsoft endpoint that's accessing it.
Awesome. And the new okay, features. The 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 switch is now to Graph, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Which workloads are the easiest to migrate to Graph?
Email is the easiest because it's more or less there's more or less no gaps in mail. So if you're doing CRUD operations, you're sending email. That's the easiest thing to do to migrate up the graph. You shouldn't really be sending email via EWS now because it's a simple migration. You'll get straight over. There's no sort of blockers. They've just released the migration endpoints in Graph, so it's gone GA in the last couple of weeks. So you can import messages from either on-prem EWS or from, from another tenant or whatever you want to do. So if you're backing up or migrating, you can sort of use that endpoint to do it. Um, the more complicated ones are probably around, well, calendaring's a little bit complicated. Um, I think when you get into something like tasks, because it's, tasks change to do, so some of the interfaces are a little bit incomplete, so you can't do things like access the old MAPI properties, the what they call the single value properties in Graph via the new to do API. So that's a bit of a pain. So if you're using it's okay if you're sort of just using it as is, but if you've done custom things, if you've got classic you've got Outlook forms that you've used or other apps that have been developed over years, that's kind of when you start having issues. Where you've sort of got to either maybe rethink the process or try and find some sort of workaround to get it going.
Mm, If some has a large legacy EWS application, where should they start with the migration?
Which is, I think Thomas, one of the exchange guys in the product team, he's developed an AI analysis tool. So it's something you can point at a code, your code base. So if it's obviously it needs to be in .NET to work, it'll sort of analyze all the AWS operations that are in use, and then it will go and suggest which graph operations you can use. Obviously, the graph SDKs are great because it's kind of all the underlying things like retries and throttling, the SDK is going to handle that for you. So you don't sort of have to reinvent the wheel, and it's going to make your migration a lot easier. So that's probably the best place to start if you're starting from, you've got an existing application that's written in obviously .NET. Take a look at that AI tool from the Exchange team. It will kind of help you get most of the way there. And obviously, a lot of the LLMs these days are pretty good. They know about what's happening out there. If you just cut and paste your code into them, it it'll suggest pretty much it'll get you 99% of the way there. It's only the kind of places where there are gaps that you're gonna have some issues.
And are there patterns or architectures that migrates especially well?
Like I said, all the email stuff is pretty easy. It's just when you sort of get into like synchronization. Synchronization is the hard part. Um, The graph, they've got Delta endpoints, which are quite good and actually probably better than what was in AWS. Some of the notification stuff is an issue because um, AWS had a few different notification patterns. It had push notifications, it had pull notifications, and it had streaming notifications. Streaming notifications were, sort of a technology of the time. It sort of allowed you to have an endpoint where you didn't have to have a public accessible IP, and you could sort of push back down to it. Um, they sort of got used a little bit in Teams as well as hanging notifications was called behind the screens. But in Graph, all you have is webhooks, so you have to have a public accessible IP, either on Azure or AWS or whatever platform that you want, and that's going to be pushing out to that um, IP, and then you're going to have some sort of notification background. Usually with those apps, they tend to be mobile apps. So there's, how that, whatever sort of you're using on the mobile side, whether it's Apple or Android, you can sort of push back down to your mobile devices. So it's an architectural change if you're using streaming notifications, but it's doable. It's just a little bit more complex.
Mm, And did you see, or what is the biggest mistakes organization make during migration, and how can they prevent these mistakes?
I guess with migration, it's just proper planning. They're not things. As long as if you've got good planning in place, generally migrations will go relatively smoothly. Um, the size of the data you're migrating is always tricky, and then that's when you start hitting throttling, I guess, and that's probably one of the challenges in Graph is that um, throttling rates in Graph in terms to migrating data into it are sort of and doing operations around it are a lot less than EWS. When EWS, you could use a lot more threads, you could use a lot more connections, a lot more operations. Graph's going to limit that a bit. So you do need to think about how many threads you can have running against a mailbox at a time, how many operations that you can do, and to make sure that your code is actually running relatively efficiently or written relatively efficiently, which is not always the case. I mean, yeah.
And what is the one thing Graph does better than EWS from your perspective?
What's the one thing it does better? Definitely, it does authentication better. um, that's a good question. I think it's more it's an integration thing because it's using JSON. That means it integrates with a lot of open source libraries. So for especially for front end developers, it's great because you can use whatever library you want. Using with EWS, you had SOAP and XML, and XML is a lot harder to deal with. If you've done web dev development, you'll know that. So JSON, it kind of made things in the development world a lot easier. And, the easier applications are to build, generally, the more reliable they are as well. I think at the end of the day.
Every change, I think it's hard for the people. And is there one thing developers still miss from EWS?
I think it's just the way it was engineered. EWS was obviously built back in 2007, and kind of when they built things in so 2007, they tended to engineer them better. So it's, you've got access to most things, and there's less sort of at the time EWS came out, we were comparing parity against MAPI, and EWS never hit sort of parity with MAPI either. But it got pretty much all the way there, and it became an easier way to, I guess, access any of the mail APIs and than the APIs that preceded it. I think probably what we'll miss most with AWS is sort of that accessibility, and it's just the sort of knowledge base that's built up over the years because it's, people's applications, they kind of tend to evolve over years. So most AWS code bases that are around now are very mature, or scripts that people have built are very mature. They're run reliably. Now they've got to go to another API, and they sort of have to go through that process again, find out where the bugs are, get to that mature point where their code is going to run reliably, and yeah, be happy with it, I guess.
Yeah, have a look a little bit in your blog, and also I say for the people, they can find all the links from you in the show notes. Um, but yeah, you've written extensively about Graph Mail APIs. Where has Graph matured the most in the recent years?
I think since they announced the depreciation, they started working again on actually improving it or adding stuff back into it. Because you can see from the change log that there was this massive gap from basically 2018 to probably 2023, where kind of not much changed at all, and they didn't add anything in there. Now they're evolving, they're adding new endpoints. I think some of the recent one was the user configuration endpoint. So now you can access those user configuration um, items, which basically it sort of moves in more and allows you to automate things behind the scenes, which can be it's sort of it's an enabler for applications. So that's, yeah, it's an important. It's kind of one of the, I guess, one of the things that gets a bit lost between EWS and Graph, because EWS, you have full access to the mailbox. It's a great enabler for kind of anything you want to do. If you want to create a shortcut, or you want to sort of build some sort of uh, thing that's sort of just outside the norm of what Microsoft are doing, AWS is the great enabler for that. With Graph, you're a bit more locked down. So, things like newer features like Outlook roaming signatures, there's still no API to do that. It's just a bit of a pain point, I think.
And which newer Graph endpoints or capabilities are, yeah, developers overlooking?
Probably the import. export API is an important one because it gives you back full access to everything. Before that, you couldn't really access every mail folder in a mailbox. You couldn't access every item within a mailbox. Now you can sort of do that now with the import and export API, which is good. Is that there are things like the folder associated items that don't quite allow you access to, which is a bit of pain. Um, but it's kind of it's a bit of a get out of jail card for a lot of things that the Mailbox import export API. If you're doing things that are sort of outside of the norm, I think.
You have covered sending meme, no joke, MIME messages with graph. Why is MIME still important in modern mail workflows?
Um, I guess because it's sort of the open standard. So a lot of people, if you have a mail system outside of Exchange, Gmail, Yahoo, whatever it is, those messages are going to be MIME. So being able to put those my messages back into Exchange or converting from or converting to is pretty important. A lot of line of business applications, once you take a message outside of Exchange, they'll store it natively in mine. Exchange is a bit of an outlier, I guess, from a storage point of view, in that it has its own sort of proprietary way of storing messages, which isn't mine. So things get converted to and from mine when they hit the Exchange store.
What are your recommendations for handling large mailbox operations efficiently in Graph?
I think that they are a challenging graph. Especially if you're doing large scale data discovery. So you're crawling a mailbox and you want to look at every item in a mailbox for a particular reason because you're teaching LLM about the user's behavior or the way they use messages or whatever the communications are. I think having good filtering and trying not to do too much, I guess, at once. If you have notification applications, you may get a notification storm, but a graph restricts you to 4 connections to a mailbox. So you need to make sure that you probably queue those operations, deduplicate them where you can, and make sure you don't sort of go over that 4 connection limit or your application's not going to work the way you want it to work.
Yeah, I read some discussions. Um, are Delta queries and change notification matured enough for enterprise graph sync solutions?
Um, I've just written an article about that, which will come out somewhere soon, hopefully. I'm saying yes, because that means the older streaming notifications. If you built a streaming notification app on Exchange, getting it to run reliably in the cloud was challenging because with a streaming notification app, it had to have a connection 24 hours a day to your mailbox, and if that mailbox moved in the cloud, that connection would generally break. Um, You'd have to resubscribe a lot of times, so getting it to run reliably was tricky. Once you had your code base there, it was generally fine. Um, the graph, things like webhooks, because they were sort of cloud native, and a lot of those, the old notification mechanisms in EWS, they're all built before the cloud ever existed. So they're all sort of pre-cloud, and then they do obviously work within the cloud, but not as well as the stuff that was built post. So things like the webhooks and graph work a lot more efficiently, and the delta operations are generally better than in the graph than they are in AWS.
Mm. And when you can, what lessons should developers learn about batching and pagination early on?
Yeah, batching's an interesting one. I don't really agree with the batch limits that are in place in the graph. It's kind of a one size fits all. It's 20 items for every workload. I know in AWS, because I worked in the migration space, the kind of the best sort of point was around 50 items a batch for doing migrations. And you could sort of optimize up and down a little bit, depending on how large. the items were you were importing or exporting. So you kind of lose that flexibility. So you sort of you're stuck at the 20 item batches. They have actually fixed because there was a bug um, in Exchange where with batching in Graph where if you tried to batch 20 items, it would actually try and do it all concurrently. So it would just basically exceed the um, mailbox concurrency limit. But now it sort of handles it for you. So, but you're still limited to that sort of one batch of 20 items, which will then, it'll be run concurrently across the 4 threads that are available um, for the mailbox. Those concurrent thread limits are a little bit lower, or a little bit too low. So we're trying to get Microsoft to change them, but it's hard. It's hard to get that across the line.
Okay. I think you MVP, you can say it to Microsoft.
I've said it, and I've said it repeatedly, and they didn't listen. And I said it repeatedly when they first introduced that limit, and they didn't listen to me back then.
Yeah,
And
no. Oh, but
maybe they're listening a little bit more these days. But yeah, it was crazy at the time they did it, and I tried to get that point across to them, and yeah,
yeah, no, we
it's
have
more crazy now.
we have a look into performance and scale. I will look a little bit more in the authentication and security part. Um, how has modern authentication uh, changed exchange development?
I think it's changing in a good way. I mean, we had a couple of years ago, we had the basic auth depreciation, so and that should have really highlighted to people which apps are running EWS. They should know from back then. I guess obviously company employment changes, people sort of come and go, so they should know which applications from that depreciation are using EWS, and that they should know which ones to target for this sort of depreciation. Um, I think it's made things easier. I hope people aren't hard coding username and passwords in their scripts anymore. I've certainly seen a lot of that over the years. Um, but yeah, access tokens are a great thing. Having a timed access token that only lasts for 1 hour it's a hell of a lot more secure than it was. But yeah, we're moving away from AWS impersonation now, and more granular permissions in Graph is kind of where the benefits are coming in. That's kind of where it's where we're sort of trying to move for a more secure future, I guess.
um, yeah, but when we look a little bit about, I say the old on-prem time, and now we are in the cloud first time. Um, do developers fully understand how much security architecture matters now compared to the older exchange models, especially on-prem?
I hope so. And that the granular permissions in Graph is kind of why Microsoft are depreciating EWS. You sort of if you have an application that needs to access any sort of mail data within AWS, you kind of have to give it everything. So it gets access to all your email, all your calendar, all your tasks, everything, all you send email. But Graph has things so you can just limit it to basic mail read access. You can, I mean, if you just need it to access email, then you can just access email. If you need it just to send email, you can just let it send email. So I think that's an important thing probably to consider when you are migrating from AWS to Graph is to look at those granular permissions and start locking it down. Start looking at least restrictive, the least restrictive you can make or your permissions for your applications, and that's it's going to benefit you going down the track.
What was the biggest out mistake you still see in production ads?
I think over security wise, it's overuse of impersonation because once you start labeling EWS impersonation, you give it access to everything within your tenant, which is generally a bad thing. Um, yeah, I think impersonation, the use of impersonation is probably the worst. Well, yeah, and I think not ordering as well, not ordering your permission use, is probably a bad thing as well. But it's a good question actually.
What's your preferred stack today to build mail integrations?
Well, I guess if you're building integrations, you're building integrations into clients. Is that what the question is about? Because
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
obviously mail add-ins because they obviously work across. They're going to work across New Outlook. They're going to work across Outlook on the web. You generally shouldn't be building com-based plugins for a classic Outlook, even though it's in some ways a nicer API and a more fully featured API. You should be doing mail add-ins. I haven't I'm actually I kinda like the mail add-in. Haven't done them for a while, but the ones that I built, I kinda like the development, sort of the experience around those.
Mhm. Are PowerShell and scripting automation still underrated in Microsoft 365 development from your perspective?
Um, I don't know, underrated. I mean, I installed OpenClaw a while ago and started playing around with that, and if you look, on Windows, it just writes PowerShell scripts that access the Exchange store via the graph. I mean, it doesn't write particularly good ones either. That's the one thing if you're looking at code efficiency, OpenClaw is an example of something that can tend to not write very efficient scripts, or it's possibly because the LLMs I've been using. But I think, yeah, I think with PowerShell scripting, LMs are getting a lot better at writing them these days. So I used to do a lot of work, just sort of one-offs for people who were writing PowerShell scripts to do particular admin features and functions. And these days, you can get an LM to write that sort of stuff. Um, I think a lot of people ask for the admin side of Exchange, the admin APIs. Why aren't they in Graph? I kind of think that's an overrated thing, to be honest. I would there is REST APIs that back a lot of that stuff now that are private. Um, and if you're smart enough, you can make use of those. Yeah, I don't know about that one.
I use Script Runner. I love it. What tools or SDKs do you find yourself recommending most often?
Primarily the PowerShell Graph SDK. It's a lot easy. It's easy to use. Most things you can sort of get down to a couple of lines of code, but I think from a reliability perspective, because it handles throttling, it handles retries. It's also, it's availability. It's kind of easy to get out there if you're writing stuff for customers. Um, they're going to be happy with it. Otherwise, and the generally the code it writes is a lot more readable as well. I find people tend to find that a lot more readable and a lot more usable for them. So yeah, gen- I would sort of recommend the PowerShell SDK.
Mm, and you are blogging since 2004. I think this is amazing. It's 20, over 20 years. Oh,
Yeah.
it's really amazing. What motivated you to keep documenting all this technical details?
I guess personally, I'm kind of a maker at heart. I think some of the maker ethos is to actually, share what you're doing, share what you create. And then when I started interacting more with the community, you would get questions from people. So how can I do this? And if you could come up with a solution, that'd be great. And that creates great material for the blog. I think a lot of that's changed in the last couple of years because of LLMs. Substack has kind of died off, unfortunately. So you get a lot less sort of those forum based questions and interactions with the community. So I find a lot of my Substack material is sort of me interacting with LLMs and getting bad answers and bad information, and sort of I've sort of tried to really double down on creating more and more long technical articles to teach the LLMs. So you sort of, and I find that it is working. The questions that I ask now are the answers are better, and I can tell that it's regurgitating a lot of the information that I'm writing as well. So it's kind of it's kind of good. But it is at its heart. I find that it's kind of the maker ethos. It's about sharing what you're doing and making, well, I guess, making other people's lives a lot easier as well.
I have looked at your blog and some marketing tools, and it's amazing. You rank out sometimes Microsoft Tech Community and the Microsoft Tour, and this is really awesome. Uh, did you expect that your blog became such a major resource for Exchange developers, or what was it the plan, or is it? Yeah, I don't know. It's
No, not really, not really. I mean, I think the first thing I wrote that really went viral was, an RSS feed for Exchange. It's a really simple thing, and, going back a number of years, it's a simple thing. The RSS project was really simple, and actually writing the script, I think it was written in Monad or probably Monad at the time, or PowerShell, what later became PowerShell. Um it's been a lot of fun, I think, over the years. I've really enjoyed writing the blog and especially interacting with the community, especially the MVP community. It's, great bunch of people. And obviously now, obviously you get to deal with the guys in the product team, trying to help them across the line with this EWS migration as well. It's really about getting the information out there and sort of, I feel a little bit responsible for this EWS depreciation because a lot of people have picked up my material and it's still being used. So we kind of need to get them off that EWS side and into the graph stuff to make sure that whatever they're doing is going to continue to work in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a little bit looked also in LLM linker, and I see your blog is really, really often citated by LMNs. So it's yeah, you feed all these LMNs for free. That's a little bit unfair, or?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it sort of always pays itself back. I've been freelancing since about 2000 and was 2010. So it sort of always pays itself back in jobs and customers. And um, I don't know. Maybe in the future, maybe it won't. I don't know. LLMs will sort of take over our jobs depending on who you sort of listen to. But I think it's, you know we sort of move forward together. I think that's the ethos. I think, I think there's always a place for makers in this world. So I'm hoping I'm going to be okay. But that it's kind of, I think, if you look at other makers, around, it's kind of what we do.
And also, I have seen you're on Stack Overflow, and you have answered over 1,000 questions. That is also awesome. What makes Yeah, what makes Exchange developer community unique, would you say?
Yeah, Stack Overflow is unfortunately dying. It's, the number of questions I think I've answered this year is probably within the, well, under 100, where usually a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand maybe. It's Yeah, it's a bit of a shame. I find that, LMs, it's just, the way people are now getting information is different. Um, I think the exchange community, I guess as a whole, is a bit different. Maybe it's aging out. I don't know. But I always enjoyed the Met conferences, which were the Microsoft Exchange conferences, because it was just basically one subject, and all of the people that attended the conferences were great. I think even I think I got I mean, the people that I sort of met at those conferences, I think I did work for years. And it's yeah, exchange the exchange communities. I don't know. It's hard to describe, I guess, or hard to put into words.
And I also see, yeah, you contribute a lot to open source projects, and is there one project tool you are especially proud of?
I wrote. I wrote a really early on. I wrote I call it exe rest, which was kind of it was a precedence to what is now the PowerShell graph SDK. It was kind of because there wasn't anything before that. So I wrote a library. I still use it personally because there's a lot of stuff I find that is good in there. Yeah, open source is an interesting topic, especially when we're talking about depreciation, because there's a lot of EWS open source libraries that other people maintain, where they haven't really got out the message that EWS has been depreciated in Exchange Online. So I guess for anyone listening to this, if you are using one of those libraries, and there's a popular Python library, there's popular PHP ones. Yeah, just take a look at that one because they're the things that aren't going to be as easy to migrate from, because they're an open source library. There's a lot of effort that's been put in them to make them user friendly. So your move the graph may be a little bit more trickier. So yeah, but
Do
yeah,
you think
being an open source maintainer is a really hard job. So I'm not having a go at those people that are maintaining those projects. Um, but I would like for those people to be putting on their front pages, hey, people that are on Microsoft 365 that are using this library, hey, look at your migration paths because it's going to be an issue for you.
do you think Graph eventually becomes a single RP service for all Microsoft 365 workloads?
Um, yeah, good question. I would. It would be good if it did become that. Um, I think Graph has been a. It's a really great idea conceptually, but it can be a bit of a blocker for innovation because it tends to be slow for things to come onto. Microsoft release new features, and then there's maybe 2 or 3 years before you see them on Graph. Um, so it's not. I think from a competitive nature in the environment, in the tech environment for ISVs, they kind of need that. They need that as soon as a feature is released in the Outlook client or on Exchange Online, that they have access to it, and they can use it in whatever they want, ever they want to do it, and to build their businesses. I think that's an important thing that gets missed by Microsoft in the graph, I think.
Um, where do you think Microsoft Mail development is heading over the next 3, 5, 10 years?
I hope that they've learnt their lesson, and that they will start lighting up new, endpoints in the graph because, as a whole, mail development is a little bit static. Um, you go to a conference, you don't see sessions on mail development anymore. Everyone's sort of moved on to Teams or other collaboration platforms. I think there's still there's still there's still potential in mail development. Um, I think people have been trying to kill off email for ages. Saying email is dead. You in some ways in some ways its usage has changed. Obviously, a lot of people use Teams these days, but there's still a whole bunch of business and other things that email is kind of critical for and will go on being critical for. So we need good APIs and with people working within in that space to kind of allow us to have that technology have those APIs as an enabler for whatever we're doing. Obviously, AI and how our Copilot's going to access and how that's going to change things within the client sphere is going to be interesting, and that's probably where the actions are going to happen in the next couple of years, I guess.
Okay, awesome. So now come one of my favorite parts of all sessions. It's the rapid fire round. So I ask a question and give the what first come in your mind as answer. So your favorite exchange version,
2007, I think it introduced AWS, so that's
most underrated graph capability,
I think import export for the moment. Yeah.
one API feature you wish Microsoft would add tomorrow.
Roaming signatures, definitely roaming signatures.
Tabs or space?
What was the question? Sorry.
Tabs or space?
Oh, tabs or space? I use tabs.
Okay. PowerShell or C sharp?
Um, C sharp. It's just, but I write everything in PowerShell still. Like I say, I think PowerShell is just a lot easier for people to understand.
One debugging tool you can't live without.
Fiddler and the AWS editor. I think probably and MAPI, MSC MAPI. Sorry, there's like lots of
And
ones I can't live without.
at the last round, best piece of career advice you ever received.
Best piece of career advice. Um, I don't know. I've never received much career advice.
uh, so yeah, we are running out of time. So yeah, my final question is: if listeners take away one thing about EWS requirement, what should it be?
Log into your portal tomorrow and look at your EWS usage report and see what's being used. That's really important because the time to migrate is now, or you should have really done it. But obviously, a lot of vendors are still catching up. But yeah, you've only got sort of 4 months till I guess the first switch off happens, and then after that, you've got sort of 6 months to sort of remediate anything that you can remediate, and then it's going to go completely. If you're using public folders, public folders are a sort of an are sort of going away, or in EWS terms, are going to be unaccessible. So you're going to need to look for another solution there as well if you are using EWS against public folders.
Yeah, awesome. So thank you. I think, yeah, I would say all the people should look at your GitHub, Stack Overflow, Substack, and so on. So they find all the links in the show notes. It was awesome. I learned a lot, and yeah, I think I have to look. Or we have some legacy systems. We would And yeah, so thank you so much for joining, and yeah, have a great day, and yeah, bye. Thank you. Awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Broker. It's been great talking to you.